morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the PSG Consulting First Mondays webinar for the month of March. My name is Patricia Anderson. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I will be your producer for today. The chat is closed to the audience, but we do want to hear from you. Please feel free to post your questions and comments in the Q&A at any time. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our host, Paige Gardner.
Hi, thank you, Patricia, and welcome back, folks. Today, as we consider the 2024 presidential election and all the dynamics that will determine its outcome, we want to consider key demographic groups and their role in that election and what the part they will play, each of the demographic groups. But this is an audience approach. It's an important one, but only one aspect to consider. Another is the cross-cutting dynamics that will determine election. What cultural forces are at play that we need to appreciate? And how do we anticipate them, prepare for their influence, measure their impact, and with what audiences? And what do these mean strategically and tactically? There certainly is a dynamic between both cultural change and political change, and that's part of what we want to explore. So we're going to look at these dynamics and explore these topics over the next few months as we approach 2024. And the speakers today are going to help introduce this topic and illuminate some of the dynamics at play. We'll start with Robert Jones. He gives us an overview of some of the patterns of electoral behavior that are encouraging as well as sobering. He is the president and founder of the Public Religion Research Institute and the author of White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, which won a 2021 American Book Award. He is also the author of The End of White Christian America. He holds a PhD in religion from Emory University and a Master's of Divinity from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. Christopher Sebastian Parker is a political science professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He takes a behavioral approach to race and historic events. He's written a number of books winning the APSA Association Awards, including Fighting for Democracy, Black Veterans and the Struggle Against White Supremacy in the Post-War South, and Change They Can't Believe in, the Tea Party and Reactionary Politics in America. He is currently working on The Great White Hope, Donald Trump, Race, and the Crisis of American Democracy. Bill McKibben is an author and educator, environmentalist, who has recently helped found Third Act to build a progressive organizing movement for people over the age of 60. He also founded the first global grassroots climate campaign, 350.org, and serves as the Schumann Distinguished Professor in Residence at Middlebury College in Vermont. Bill is a winner of multiple prestigious awards that have earned him international recognition. His latest book is The Flag, the Cross, and the Station Wagon, A Graying America Looks Back at Its Suburban Boyhood and wonders what the hell happened. Okay, I'm with you. All right, we'll start with Dr. Jones.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Happy to be here. I've got some slides I'm going to share here. All right, let me get this kicked off. Great. So I'm going to start with basically two things. One is a big overview of just what the religious landscape looks like, and kind of overlaid with political affiliation as well. And then some insights from a very recent survey that we at PRI just completed in partnership with the Brookings Institution on Christian nationalism, and what kind of a threat that is for democracy and American culture. So I'll end with that. But first, just a couple of overview slides of where we are in the country and the changing American religious landscape. So this first slide is just a pie chart of the major religious groups as kind of political scientists, sociologists tend to break them out. We tend to break them out by race and religion. That has to do with how they behave on the ground, and historically also because religion has been deeply divided by race, and the country has developed along racial tracks in the country. And what I've done here is colored the pie charts. This kind of blue shades, kind of tealish blue shades, are varieties of white Christian Americans. And this is kind of part of, to really understand America, the cultural change in America today, you really do have to understand the shifts among white Christian Americans. These are white, non-Hispanic Christians. And if you kind of look here, what we basically see today is that they make up about 42%, if you put all of them together, 42% of all Americans. And that has actually changed quite dramatically. The book that Paige referenced, The End of White Christian America, I wrote in 2016, was picking up the front end of this change, where I noticed that we had moved just from the beginning of Barack Obama's presidency at that time to 2015. We had moved from being a majority white Christian country to one that was no longer a majority white Christian country. At that time, if you go back to 2008, white Christians made up 54% of the country. By 2015, that number had dropped to 47. And today that number has dropped again to 42. And I think that this dynamic and this shift of the country, demographically speaking, moving from majority white Christian country to one no longer majority white and Christian is really important and often overlooked dynamic that I think is feeding a lot of the visceral reactions, has actually fed a lot of the energy into the MAGA movement. I know we're going to be talking a lot about that. But let me show you what this looks like.
Dr. Jones.
Hello?
Dr. Jones, so sorry to interrupt. Would you mind, could you use slideshow mode? We're seeing your presenter mode.
Oh, weird. Okay, let's see. That is a good question. How do I do that? I've never had it flip into that mode before.
So I see something at the top that says use slideshow. Maybe we try that.
Ah.
Yep, there you go. Thank you. Again, apologies for the
All right, sorry about that, everyone. But now it's got my, there we go. Okay. So this is what we were seeing before. So this slide, yeah, thank you for that. May be surprising for folks. So this is the three major white Christian subgroups in the country: white evangelical Protestants that we hear so much about, and has been the core of the MAGA movement; white mainline Protestants, these are non-evangelical Protestants in the country; and then white Catholics as well. This is the percent of the population they have comprised since 2006, all the way up through last year. Each of these samples, by the way, are very, very large samples. Starting in 2013, in particular, there are at least 40,000 interviews a year that we're tracking here. So the margin of error is very, very low on these, which is why we're showing actually decimal points here. But the main thing to see is you just kind of look at the decline. It's all white Christian groups have been on the decline over the last decade and some change. But what may be surprising is that white evangelicals, right, which have been so prominent during the Trump era, have actually gone from being nearly a quarter of the population in 2006 to our latest numbers, which have them down at 13.6% of the population. So for all of the noise we hear about white evangelical Protestants, they only make up 13.6% of the population, and their median age today is 56. So they are both shrinking and graying as they're hemorrhaging mostly young people. If you look, the white non-evangelical Protestants, also white Catholics, have been on the decline, but they've also been fairly stable since 2013, whereas white evangelicals have continued to decline. So it may be a little bit counterintuitive just based on what it seems like in the headlines and their influence in the GOP. But on the other hand, what we see here in the orange line is the rise of the religiously unaffiliated in the country, which today they're closing in on being 3 in 10 Americans. It's nearly 27% of the country. And among young people today, I should just add, that number is nearly 40% among young adults under the age of 30. So this is something we've never really seen in the country before. It's something new. We'll talk about that later, but it's really notable that essentially the religiously unaffiliated are twice as big, for example, as white evangelical Protestants are in the country. So I want to show you just a little bit. This is a little bit of an unorthodox way to display this, but I wanted to put both kind of age and religion and political affiliation all in one chart to kind of give you a sense of how these things interplay. And what I've done here is you kind of ignore the top and the bottom and just look at the age cohorts. This is the religious makeup of each age cohort. You kind of think about this as a kind of archaeological dig down through generational strata, what you would find in terms of religious affiliation. And if you just look at 18 to 29-year-olds versus seniors, 65 and older, you see this huge difference. Again, I've kind of coded different varieties of white Christian groups in blue, just because that's one of the biggest differences. You see seniors, nearly 6 in 10 seniors are white and Christian, and that number is under 3 in 10 among American adults ages 18 to 29. And you'll see the kind of pink lines there of religiously unaffiliated, the vast differences between there. And then what I did is I just overlaid the religious composition of the two political parties on top of this chart, so you can kind of see where they fall. And if you kind of compare them in terms of, I kind of put them roughly in order where they would fall as if they were an age cohort. But the takeaway from all this is that, the Democratic parties, these are self-identified Democrats in public opinion surveys. They look like 20-something-year-old America in terms of their racial and religious makeup. The Republican Party looks about like 70-year-old America, or even older. And so you can see this kind of vast difference, particularly among white evangelicals and white Christians in particular. I mean, the Republican Party today is, increasingly a kind of monolithic ethno-religious party, a kind of white Christian party. It's 2/3 white and Christian, compared again to like less than 3 in 10. It's actually only about a quarter of Democrats who are white and Christian. And I think that's part of the drivers and why we're seeing religion appeals to white Christian identity and Christian nationalism, which I'll talk about in just a second, becoming increasingly a part of the rhetoric among Republican candidates and the Republican Party, even as the country is changing quite dramatically in a different direction. So we recently did a big major national survey with the Brookings Institution, trying to quantify Christian nationalism and how many Americans believed in Christian nationalism. And we basically developed a scale using 5 questions. And the way this works, we took a composite measure of Americans who agreed with each of these 5 questions. You can see they're fairly straightforward, but they're also, the bar is kind of high here. We tried not to make these soft questions, but the U.S. government should declare America a Christian nation. Pretty straightforward. U.S. laws should be based on Christian values, et cetera. You can see and these are the percent of all Americans who agree with those statements. But if we put them all together into a composite measure and measure adherence to Christian nationalism, this is basically what we find in the country, is that about 10% of Americans essentially strongly agree with all 5 of those questions. And we called that group Christian nationalism adherence. Another 19% agreed with those, but maybe less strongly than those in the adherence category. We called that group sympathizers. So essentially, it's about 3 in 10 Americans who lean into supporting these ideas of Christian nationalism, and on the other side, it's about 2/3 of the country that leans the other way. So on the one hand, the glass half full side of this is that by a margin of 2 to 1, Americans essentially reject this worldview of Christian nationalism, but it is a sizable minority, and as we'll see, they're loaded into disproportionately among white evangelicals and Republicans, which is why it's having such an outsized influence on our politics. So just a couple of things along these lines here. These are kind of major religious groups down the left, and their rates of adherence or sympathizing toward those 5 questions on Christian nationalism. And you can see there's really no group that looks different than white evangelical Protestants here. 2/3 or nearly 2/3 of them, 64%, are either adherents or sympathizers. This other Protestants of color category is only 3% of the country. It's a very small group that's made mostly of Asian American and Pacific Islander Protestants. So it's a very small group. But the other group that really I think strategically is important are Latino Protestants, who are at 43%. So not nearly as high as white evangelicals, but they tend to sort of, this is a group that tends to kind of vote Republican. They voted about 6 in 10 Republican in the last couple of election cycles for Trump. And they tend to share a lot of the worldview of white evangelical Protestants. And then you can see it drops off pretty significantly from there. And can talk about some of these other groups if we want to later. But you'll notice the big difference, though, between like Latino Protestants and Latino Catholics are very, very large. Latino Catholics way down the list here compared to Latino Protestants. There's the other side of skeptics and rejectors here. But I think the main takeaway here are really the white evangelical Protestants and Latino Protestants that have this kind of proclivity to lean that direction or active on the Republican side of politics. The other thing to say is that there's been some kind of theorizing without much data, I should say, that these are basically people who are sometimes called Christian in name only, like they're not really connected to churches. And the theory goes that if they were actually connected to churches, they would be less sympathetic to Christian nationalism. But we actually find empirically that the opposite is true. In fact, that the more likely one is to actually go to church or attend religious services, the more likely one is to be a Christian nationalism adherent or sympathizer. So in fact, among those who attend religious services very frequently, that is once a week or more, half of them are either Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers. And you can see how it goes down. It's basically linear. The less often you go to church, the less likely you are to be a Christian nationalism adherent. And then also by party, this is the other sort of thing here. Essentially, we find that the Republican Party now is a majority of Republicans now are either Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers. So we're going to be hearing, I think, more of this as the campaigns get revved up. It is kind of a part of the core appeal to the base now as a majority of the Republican Party. Again, nearly 7 in 10 Republicans are white and Christian today, and they tend to share this, most of them tend to share this worldview about the U.S. being a Christian nation. This is also a perfect example of what social scientists often call asymmetric polarization. That is, the country is indeed polarized, but not evenly. Independents look far more alike or like Democrats than they do to Republicans on this question. So it really is Republicans and white evangelicals and those in their orbit in a very different place. I'll wrap up with just a couple of things. I'm not going to do all 5 correlates here, but I'll just lay them out for you. We also found in the survey, and we'll send a link around to the survey, you can read the whole report, but we found that Christian nationalism, that worldview, does not sit in a vacuum, but it actually exists with anti-Black racism, anti-immigrant sentiment, anti-Muslim sentiment, anti-Semitism, and patriarchal views of gender roles. Like all 5 of those things are positively correlated and kind of a part of the worldview of Christian nationalism. And I'll just give you a quick example of anti-Black racism. We have a number of questions over here that essentially measure belief in systemic racism, belief that discrimination in the past has an effect on the present, a belief in so-called reverse discrimination. And what you can see here is that all Americans are less than a majority on all these questions here. Christian nationalism adherents are 20-30 percentage points higher, basically rejecting systemic racism or the idea that and more likely to believe that discrimination against white Americans has become as bad as discrimination against others, Black Americans and other groups. But what's notable here is that even among Christian nationalism adherents, white identity does play a strong role. So even among those who agree with Christian nationalism, if you were white, there's about another 10 to 12 percentage points on most of these questions that it kind of moves you in the direction of kind of holding anti-Black racist views here, even among there. And you could see big differences among Christian nationalism adherents of color and Christian nationalism adherents who are white here. And that's a dynamic we see play out across many of these things. Same dynamic here. I won't kind of pause. I'll make the slides available later, but basically the same dynamic on anti-immigrant views. And we see it also, again, in anti-Muslim views, anti-Semitic views, and views about traditional gender roles. And finally, 2 last slides. When we add kind of a question here that really gets at European identity and white identity in the country, we see that this is also very highly correlated. So we ask this question: do you agree or disagree that God intended America to be a new promised land where European Christians could create a society that would be an example to the rest of the world? By and large, Americans reject that statement 2 to 1. But if you look at Christian nationalism adherents, it's 83%. Either completely agree or mostly agree with that question. Among sympathizers, it's also 67%, 2/3 there. It drops off very quick among Christian nationalism skeptics and rejectors here. And so this kind of white identity is also kind of part of the package. White Christian identity, it really is an ethno-religious identity and movement that is fueling all of this. It's not really just white nationalism. It's not just Christian nationalism. It's white Christian nationalism that is really fueling the thing here. And then finally, and just most disturbingly, that among those who agree with this idea of Christian nationalism, they're also much more likely to believe that they may have to resort to violence, political violence, to save the country. So very, very few Americans are willing to agree with the statement that true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save the country. But 4 in 10 Christian nationalism adherents do agree with that statement. And you can see it's very different here among other, even among sympathizers, it's far less. But among that group that's Christian nationalism adherents, this idea not only does the country belong to them and by divine right, but they're really willing to pick up arms and contemplate acts of violence to reclaim it or to hold on to it as they see it. All right, well, that was a sprint through, but I'll stop there and look forward to discussion.
Dr. Parker.
Yes. Thank you very much. I mean, that was great. That was great, Dr. Jones. Huge fan, and it was good to see that. I actually have some questions, not for online. I'll wait till we connect offline. So anyway, what I'm going to talk about, there's going to be some overlap between what Dr. Jones presents and what I present. So basically the significance of MAGA and the MAGA movement. So fellow Americans, we're going to return to this question at the very end of this presentation. The overview of what we're going to examine today: what does MAGA believe? What are their preferences? Who they are? What motivates MAGA? Answering the eternal "so what" question. Why is this important? And then I'll wrap things up in the conclusion. So I'm going to move a little fast here. Assessing MAGA's preferences. So basically, I'm going to start backwards and work my way forwards, just to show you what their preferences are, just to whet your appetite, and then to tell you what drives those preferences. This survey, the data I'm going to present is based on a nationally representative sample of roughly 2,400 that was sponsored by Mike Podhauser. Thank you, Mike, if you're out there. This is a panel study. The data was collected between December 2021 and November 2022. We interviewed the same people 3 times during this span. This permits us, this is really important. The results we're going to see right now, we are controlling for a host of competing explanations: partisanship, ideology, core socioeconomic status, Christian nationalism, because we had to control for that, authoritarianism, racism, among others. So the results that we're going to see, we're accounting for these other competing explanations. And so what does this mean practically? If anybody has any questions about statistical control, I'm happy to discuss that at the very end in Q&A if you want to ask questions about that. So we'll begin with election denial and then January 6th, the Capitol riots. They don't believe that the 2020 election was fair. These are MAGA folks, right? Generally speaking, election results should not be honored. This is generally speaking, you guys. This is not just specifically about 2020. This is 2020 and moving forward. They believe, as a corollary, that the military should remove Biden and replace Biden with Trump. They agree that the assault on the Capitol was a good thing. And they also believe, moreover, that the rioters should not be prosecuted. Again, this is accounting for all these other competing explanations I just mentioned. Next, political choice. Of course, they voted for Trump in the 2016 primary and general election. They voted for Trump in 2020 in the general election. They support Trump if he were to run in 2024, and they supported the House GOP candidate in whatever congressional district they belong in 2020 and 2022. So reliably Republican. Their policy positions. They believe that there should be a ban on critical race theory. We found that to be the case both in December 2021 and November 2022. They favored overturning Roe in 2021 and in 2022. Of course, they rejected the mask mandate. They opposed a path to citizenship for the undocumented, and they favor, moreover, deportation of the undocumented. They believe that white folk are under attack. These folks highly identify with whiteness. They believe that the changing racial composition of the United States is harmful to the country ultimately. They subscribe to replacement theory, that is to say, this belief that progressive elites are in league with undocumented coming from other places, other countries, shithole countries, if you will, to replace white folks. And lastly, they believe that whites should still run the country even when it becomes a minority in 2042, if I'm not mistaken. Racism is not a problem for these folks. They believe it's overblown. They believe that they reject the fact that Black and Latinos communities suffer from discrimination. They believe that whites are victims of discrimination. They believe that cop killings of Black folks are isolated incidents and not a function of systemic racism. They believe that the civilians killing of Black folks, that is to say, for example, in Buffalo, isolated incident, once again, not an indication of systemic racism. And just overall, within a 7-item scale, they don't believe that racism is a big deal at all. They believe that it is completely overblown. So who they are and where they are. So we're going to look at some of the demographics here. So pretty much what we suspected, right? Almost 100%, approaching 100% white, roughly 65% Christian, more than 50% male, more than 50% retired, more than 50% over 65, approaching 50% of them have incomes over $50,000 a year, and roughly 28% of them have a college degree. These last two categories might surprise people because MAGA folks, are typically believed to be like irredeemably ignorant, dumb, stupid, and riven with economic anxiety. And nothing could be further from the truth. Where they are. So the darker the dots, the heavier the MAGA presence, right? As you can see in the major cities from urban areas from Seattle to Los Angeles to San Francisco to Houston to Chicago to Detroit, Miami, we see that we have a heavy MAGA presence in a lot of these urban areas, or in a lot of these areas that are metropolitan areas. This flies in the face of the belief that MAGA folks are generally rural people. They are not. What motivates the MAGA faction of the Republican Party? What motivates MAGA? My argument is that status threat does. And just a brief explanation of status threat is the perception of threats to one's way of life. That is to say, a threat to WASP culture. And it typically takes place or is manifest by way of social and demographic change. That could be perceived or real. It is symbolic and non-material in nature. That is to say, it gets back to this whole economic anxiety argument. So when we think about, what conventional belief was with the Tea Party and with MAGA, it was all about working class whites. No, it's not. How do you explain all these wealthy white folks who were at the Capitol riots, who supported Trump, right? This is not about material threat. This is about symbolic threat that they are losing, quote unquote, their country. This is not new. This is not a one-off. This is akin to work by Gus Feld, a sociologist in 1963 on status politics, Hofstadter's The Paranoid Style in American Politics, and Lipson and Rabb's work in 1978. And it motivates reactionary movements. This is some of the work that I've done with my colleague and friend, Matt Barreto, and some work that I've done on my own. Status threat motivates reactionary movements. MAGA politics and the so what question. Why is this so important? Why should we really care about this? Well, if you look at the political activity of MAGA folks, It's unbelievable. You get roughly 90% that signed a petition. Now, this is beyond more just conventional voting, like going out and pulling a lever or voting by mail from home. These activities actually require some energy and time. Signed a petition, contacted a representative, participated in a boycott, donated funds to a political campaign. And these are all well over 50% of folks who identify as MAGA. And then just under 50% folks attended a political meeting, right? So these folks are just generally politically engaged. And so, you know, the Republican Party knows this, and so that's why they cater to them so much. The presence of MAGA. 36% of the electorate has an overall favorable view of MAGA. You know what that translates into, people? That's over 92 million people has a generally favorable view of MAGA. 25% of the electorate has a very favorable view of MAGA, which is 65 million people. We emphasize the electorate and not simply the GOP because 66%, almost 2/3, have a very favorable view of MAGA in the GOP. But it's not restricted to the GOP. We can also see that 23% of folks who declare themselves independent have a favorable view of MAGA, a very favorable view of MAGA. 5% of Democrats have a very favorable view of MAGA, and 5% of other folks who identify with other political affiliations and parties have a very favorable view of MAGA. So this is not something that's just restricted to the GOP. And I want to make clear, I didn't mention this when I just spoke on where they rank in the Republican Party, how favorable they are in the Republican Party. Back in 2016, the number of people, the percent of Republicans who had a very favorable view of MAGA stood at 52%. Now it's 66%. The import of the MAGA movement. They are largely responsible for the election of Trump. They constitute 2/3 of the GOP rank and file. They push the GOP even further to the right, increasing polarization. And this polarization is causing the MAGA faction of the GOP to damage democracy. You know, we think about free speech, we talk about the rule of law, all of these things, election integrity, all of these things. MAGA is not a one-off thing. You know, their predecessors, they were preceded by the Klan of the 1920s, the John Birch Society of the 50s and 60s, and the Tea Party movement. The common thread is that they consider themselves real Americans. That is to say, as I showed in the demographic breakdown of MAGA, all of these other groups share these characteristics. Mainly white, almost exclusively white, middle class or better off. They tend to be male, Christian, native born, heterosexual. So unless one is in all these categories, one is not, according to them, a real American. A reaction to change, like the KKK, they were concerned about the quote unquote, the return of the quote unquote new Negro from World War I, among other factors. And those other factors would include, the first wave feminism. They would include, fear or concern associated with Catholicism, right? They were concerned with about Jews taking over Capitol. The John Birch Society, they were concerned about the civil rights movement. The Tea Party, they were concerned about Obama and what his presidency represented. Trump and MAGA is more of the same vis-a-vis Obama and what his and the change that his presidency represented. How threat works for Dems, right? So threat can be used to, to Dems' advantage. Now, I don't, this is on both sides of the street, if you will. It's mobilizing, the reactionary right, but can also mobilize communities of color. Matt and I showed this in a piece a little while ago that we published in an edited volume. And here, what I'm doing now is showing some of the work that I'm doing in conjunction with Target Smart and showing how threat mobilizes the Black community. So we have these low propensity voters. We define low and high propensity voters. Let me back up. Sorry about that. Low and high propensity voters according to voter scores, right? And some other part of the research that I'll present some other time. Here we're going to present the distinction between low and high propensity voters vis-a-vis demographics. So the first category is age. We have young that represent low propensity voters and high propensity voters are represented by older segments of the Black community. And what we see on the y-axis is the probability that folks were going to vote in the 2022 midterms. And on the x-axis, we have a composite measure of threat where we go from low, medium, and high. And what I want you folks to recognize is that the yellow and green are the older segments of the Black community, and the red and blue are the younger segments of the Black community. And what I want you guys to notice is that as we move from low to high threat, the gap between the high propensity voters, yellow and green, and the low propensity voters, red and blue, closes as we get closer to, as we approach high threat, right? Look at how much this closes. And so what that tells us is that we have a ceiling effect essentially with high propensity voters. What we're really trying to pay attention to is the slope for the low propensity voters. And the slope for the low propensity voters closes a gap between the high and the low propensity voters. Now that's just with respect to age. Now let's look at gender. For the Black community, men are relatively low propensity voters and women are relatively high propensity voters. Look at how the gap closes between low threat and high threat. I mean, just look at how fast this gap closes, which suggests that, yeah, there's a ceiling effect for Black women because they're going to turn out regardless of the threat level. But for Black men, their turnout is really contingent upon the level of perceived threat. And what happens is this gap closes dramatically between low and high propensity voters in the guise of Black men and Black women. And finally, we look at the low and high propensity voters vis-a-vis class. Low propensity voters, no college degree, high propensity voters, college degree. We recognize that this is a really simplified way of looking at class. Nevertheless, it's widely accepted. So as we can see, the gaps don't narrow a whole lot here, like relative to one another, because threat is even moving the high propensity voters here vis-a-vis the college educated Black community. But threat is also moving, the low propensity Black voters as well. We go from roughly a 62% probability of turning out for the 2022 midterms at the low end for the low propensity voters to roughly 75%, an increase to 75% probability that low propensity Black voters, in this case, Black voters without a college degree, of turning out in the 2022 midterms. So to conclude, cultural and social change is at the root of motivating the reactionary right, including now with the MAGA faction. MAGA is not a one-off. It's preceded by the Klan, the John Birch Society, and the Tea Party. The name of the movement may change, but the people that are behind these movements will not. If history is a guide, the movement will survive Trump. Solutions, turnout among communities of color is key. Fellow Americans, ultimately, that's for you to decide when it comes to the MAGA faction. And that's all I got. Thank you.
Thank you. Bill?
Hello there. Well, completely fascinating data from both these presentations, and it actually sets up quite nicely what I want to talk to you about, which is the efforts that we're undertaking to try and do what we can to change one of the most, one of the dominant demographics there, which are older voters in America. As you can tell from all those statistics, all the things that we're worried about tend to congregate in people over the age of 60. And that's a real problem because, among other things, people over the age of 60 are going to vote. There is no known way to prevent old people from voting. And that's one of the reasons that we started organizing Third Act a year ago. We understood that this is a potentially vital demographic to try and really switch. And if you go to thirdact.org, you can see some of the work that we're doing. There are 70 million Americans over the age of 60. There's 10,000 more of them every day, which is more than the number of people born in this country every day. And as I say, you have to multiply that by some factor because of their high voter turnout. Their political influence is also increased by the fact that they've ended up with most of the wealth in this country. Those of us over this age have about 70% of the country's financial assets, compared with about 5% for millennials. So it would be a good idea not to give up on this group, especially since when you turn 60, you're likely to be around for quite a while longer. You're only going to be in the 18 to 29 age group for a little while, 11 years, but when you turn 60, you likely have 25 years ahead of you as a member of our society. So let me give you some interesting news first. The AARP polled the 63 competitive House districts. As you know, most of our House districts are not particularly competitive anymore, but in the 63 places last year that the AARP figured that the election would be decided, they polled them first in the beginning of the summer. And what they found was that Republicans had a sturdy lead in about 50 of those districts, up 50 to 40%, so a 10-point margin. And those were the numbers that had the GOP salivating about a red wave in the coming, a red tsunami in the fall election. But by the time we got to Election Day, voters over 65 actually ended up breaking for Democrats in those districts, 49 to 46. So this, to me, indicates a couple of things that help guide our work at Third Act. One, these are persuadable voters, some of them. Two, one of the things that clearly persuaded them in the last election was around Social Security, Medicare, and the threats to those things, which became more obvious and which the Democrats did a better job of bringing out. But three, and I think that this is the thing that's been our unique insight, and it's really powering the rapidly mobilizing work that we're doing. We're not your grandparents' grandparents. If you look at the things that the right-wing Supreme Court took on in this retrograde summer that we've just come through, they all dated from a very particular era. They took on the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Gun Control Act of 1968, the Clean Air Act of 1970, and Roe v. Wade 73. That is, they took on the work that people now in their 60s, 70s, and 80s had been a part of, or at least witness to, in the first act of their lives, and that had defined our political landscape for most of their lives. And a large number of these people were shocked to see the attack on things that they had taken as givens, and begun to understand that they need to try and defend that world that they had helped create. This is obviously not easy for all the demographic reasons that Professor Parker and Professor Jones have outlined for us, but it's also not impossible. Third Act mobilized its, at least West Coast forces, most specifically around the state of Nevada last autumn, on the theory that this was going to be the decisive Senate race. Indeed, it turned out to be the place where, when the election was decided, Democratic control of the Senate was guaranteed. And so we had large-scale organizing efforts there, and with considerable and interesting success. When CNN wrote up the results of the elections that in Nevada, the two groups that they cited were the Culinary Workers Union in Las Vegas, which has a massive and truly impressive effort, and Third Act working in northern Nevada around Reno with a lot of door-to-door canvassing and a lot of turning out people our own age. So all we're trying to do is experiment and push to see if we cannot help older Americans redefine a little bit how they imagine their political role should be as they enter the last part of their lives. And if we can move from the place that's always been the sort of default for political scientists, that people become more conservative as they age, and at least throw that open and up for grabs, then we have a chance of making an outsized influence on how things transpire from here on out. I want to give people time to ask some questions, so I'm just going to end there because I know that there are people, especially after those two excellent presentations that we've seen, that'll have some good questions to ask. But check out the work that's underway at Third Act and tell your grandparents about what we're up to.
Thank you. Patricia, do you want to ask some questions? See what the questions are?
First, I want to invite our panelists back on screen and say thank you and see if there are any quick questions that y'all would like to ask of each other. I've been formulating one for all of you.
I actually have a question that I'd like to ask, if I may jump in here. You know, it's one of the things that I've been following that really, really interests me, that seems to be a common thread throughout, you know, both presentations, both earlier presentations. And I think part of what, you know, Bill is trying to address is the centrality of othering, and othering as you know, as such a driving force for the success of, you know, MAGA or white Christian nationalism, and some of the things that, you know, we hope to be able to address and in a very, you know, in a forthright way coming into 2024. But can you touch a little bit on sort of that phenomenon as so central to what we're seeing in American politics today?
You want to take that, Dr. Jones or Mr. McKibben? I definitely have something to say, but I'll wait for you guys first.
Go ahead.
You're muted, Bob.
Yeah.
You just Bob Jones me.
Oh, did I? I'm sorry about that.
It's one of the occupational
about that.
hazards. All right. No, but I was going to echo some of the stuff that you said. I mean, I do think that's right, that this othering idea and the, you know, we hear it all the time in Trump's rhetoric and the MAGA world rhetoric, right? Real Americans, as Dr. Parker said, who are real Americans versus not real, you know, Americans. And it is a kind of ethno-religious assertion, right? That this is a white Christian country and everyone else is here. And in fact, you know, we should remember this has not been always a marginal view. FDR said, you know, this is a Christian country and other people are here by sufferance, right? That's FDR. So, you know, it has kind of seeped in, and I think it has been a kind of competing, it was what was behind the Klan, right? The Klan, we got to remember, man, they weren't just a kind of white nationalist group. They were a Christian nationalist group. The KKK was. That's why Jews and Catholics were suspect. In fact, they were a Protestant Christian terrorist group, right? That's really important. So this has been like this kind of competing anti-democratic thread that's older than the country itself, right? That we're still kind of, I think, wrestling with, that's very deep in American DNA, particularly among, you know, white non-Hispanic Americans.
Mr. McKibben, because I got a lot to say, but
You go right ahead.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I agree with Dr. Jones. It's but I want to say that hey, look, let's keep it 100%. The original sin of this country is slavery and racism, right? That's it right there. All these other ones were Johnny-come-latelys, if you ask me. And I think that, you know, try as we might, you know, we cannot shake ourselves of the specter of race and racism. Yes, and I totally agree with what Dr. Jones. It says Christian nationalism is definitely part of it too, right? They're all of a piece with one another, right? With sort of this merging with white identity. And like Dr. Jones said, first it was Protestant, then it shifted to Christian. So this othering, what it does is, I mean, so in my humble opinion, the idea that negative affect mobilizes the reactionary right, or the right, just generally speaking, not even just the reactionary right, but the right permits the Republican Party and has permitted the Republican Party for the last, I want to say 60 years to punch above its weight class. Sort of trying to mobilize on positive affect, that is to say, hope and pride, they're not, they can, relatively speaking, they're inefficient. It's about this idea that if we think about the Kahneman and Tversky stuff on prospect theory, people are more sensitive, tend to be more sensitive to perceive losses than gains. And that's even more so on the right than the left. And so it permits the Republic, the right to punch above its weight class all the time, mobilizing on negative affect. And it's this idea that these folks are losing their country, quote unquote, their country.
Well,
And I think it's back to, a feeling of loss of country and loss of culture. And it's just so, and, as, one said, a big status threat. So,
well,
okay,
but
Patricia, I'm done.
Let's be clear that, as Dr. Parker pointed out, that the demographics are unavoidable here, which is good. As Anand Girandias said a couple of years ago, there's no country in the world has ever tried or ever succeeded in becoming a multi-ethnic democracy. And so that's what's happening in our country now. And the only question is whether it's going to happen easily or painfully. And the hope is that we can mobilize the better angels of our selves over these next few decades to take a process that no country's ever really undergone before, and have it work out as well as it possibly can. That's what the organizing that we doing is aiming for. And it'll be really interesting to see if we can't move some of these some of these statistics that people point out. The good news is that we're going inevitably in the right direction, and it's a question of how wrenching that passage is going to be. And obviously, the Trumps of the world want to make it as wrenching as it possibly can be. And one of the goals of the rest of us should be to make it as non-wrenching as it can be.
Paige, can I just follow up just very briefly?
Sure.
Go for it, Dr. Parker, please.
So what I want to communicate is that if in some of the experimental work I've done, this idea that threat mobilizes progressive forces is not limited to communities of color. I've done some experimental work showing that when it comes to independence, if you prime them with the idea that back then that Trump was an existential threat to democracy, it suggested that they would mobilize, over and controlling for a host of factors. They would mobilize this was during the 2018 midterms. They would mobilize against Trump during the 2018 midterms, and they did, right? So this, again, sort of mobilizing on aspirations, right? Hope-filled aspirations is not going to work right now. People on the progressive side or on the, who are opposing these reactionary forces have to realize that there's an existential threat to small d democracy. And if you prime folks with that, right, they are more likely to turn out. Now, that's not a great narrative to tell, that democracy rests on, threats and counter threats. But we're at a triage point right now where something needs to be done. Whatever works, we need to try it.
So Dr. Parker, you and Bill and Dr. Jones and also Paige, you've all set us up great for our closing statement. For those of us who are students of political science, if you can sort of take the 10,000, 30,000 foot view, you've hit the nail on the head, right? So we have a democracy with a bunch of different kinds of people in it. We're going to have factions. We're going to have fissures. This is, every student of political science will be able to call upon every philosopher they love and tell you exactly who predicted this outcome. So now that we're here, the question is, what question are we not asking? If you're talking to a group of organizers and folks who are trying to determine the outcomes of elections, what questions are they not asking? Where do we need to be different, act different to get a different outcome? And I'd love to hear from everybody as fast as you possibly can. I'm going to start with Dr. Jones since he hasn't spoken in a minute.
Oh, so I don't get enough time to think. All right. I'll jump in. So one thing I just want to make sure I say too on the way to answering this is we should also realize that this is kind of the inevitable and predictable arc of a Republican Party whose modern incarnation was formed on resisting the civil rights movement in the 1960s. So how do white Christians come to be in the Republican Party? So I'm from Mississippi and Georgia. My grandparents were Democrats. Right? How do they come to be in whites, Christians across the South come to be? It really is resistant. The Great White Flight from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party was absolutely precipitated by resistance to civil rights. And so we're still there, right? And that's one big thing to say. The other thing I would say is that I do think in terms of like strategies, there are groups of white Christians beyond white evangelicals that are often ignored in terms of organizing outreach. So United Methodist, Presbyterians, Episcopalians that are kind of also voted for Trump. 6 and 10 of those groups, like of the non-evangelical white Protestants, voted for Trump, but they didn't vote for him 86%. In the way that white evangelicals did. And I think that group and the religiously unaffiliated, there were some questions about that group, nearly 3 in 10 Americans, they're disproportionately young. Many of them are refugees from conservative white Christian churches. That's a group that I think is really worth kind of thinking about and ripe for, I think, some kind of organizing outreach.
Okay, I guess I'll go now. So I guess what I'll say is that, and Paige and I had a brief discussion before we went live about, trying to win back sort of working class whites. And I'm going to go out here on a limb. This is not going to be popular, but, there's some more. I just don't think that, those folks are going to come back to the Democratic Party anytime soon. Although the discussion Paige and I had were it was a little different. So I want to reframe this to be more general. So I think that they're not coming back anytime soon. I just really don't. And the reason why they're voting against their economic self-interest are these issues around culture and this idea that they're losing their country. And so as long as demographic change is happening, that is sort of implicitly associated with cultural change. And it's widely known now. So they feel like the Republican Party is going to, protect their group prestige better than Democrats are. So they're not coming back. The problem is Democrats seem to want to continue to try to win them back. But the more the Democrats try to win them back, the further the Black community moves away from the Democratic Party, right? I would just caution Democrats from trying too hard, too quickly to try to woo the working class white folks back, because this is a zero-sum game, at least when it comes to the Black community.
Thank you. Bill? Oh, you're muted.
So I think that one of them, there's a million different angles to go, especially if you're an organizer and thinking about how to do this. But I think that one of the things that's so interesting is this work around religious groups. And precisely the thing that I've been sort of thinking about was precisely what Dr. Jones was talking about. So far, the kind of narrative about what constitutes a Christian political response has been dominated by the ideas of evangelicals. And it really is time for the remaining parts of that mainline Protestant tradition, not that long ago, a quite dominant tradition in its own right in this country, to enunciate clearly the fact that there's nothing particularly Christian about what passes for Christian nationalism, i.e. it has very little to do with what's in the Bible. And I think that that's going to be fruitful organizing work, and it's certainly some of the work that the faith working groups at Third Act are involved in, because they tend to be people who came from, who remember that different political age when those Methodists and Presbyterians and Congregationalists and things were dominant. So I think that actually may be a place where there's some powerful organizing work to be done.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Trying to tackle a giant PhD question in 2 minutes or less. Really appreciate all of you for that. And we're going to turn over to Paige for a closing word.
I appreciate all the really, really fascinating presentations, and I look forward to hearing from you and about your work a lot more as we approach the 2024 presidential cycle, because I think what you're doing is essential to understanding how we began to, help small d democracy survive. Thank you very much.
Bye. Thanks for the invitation, Paige.
Thank you. Bye-bye.